So welcome to this second class on the principle or the theme of mobility and stability. And the thing I would like to explore today is differentiating between mobilizing through weight and flow or mobilizing through momentum. And they're very different experiences for your body and for your musculature. And momentum can sometimes feel really satisfying, could feel a bit scary, could feel more familiar to people who dance a lot. But there's something also about going slower and activating weight and flow with a weight shift that mobilizes, but with a different sense of support. And so this principle of mobility and stability is not about one or the other. It's about both of them at the same time, but in different kinds of proportions, so that maybe mobility comes more into the foreground or stability is more in the foreground, but it's got the support of the other quality in it in order to find a synergistic relationship between how you find growth and find some sort of foundation, and that kind of process going on all the time. So we can think about how we can differentiate the parts of our body that might initiate or allow some sort of mobility, some sort of movement to travel through. Or we can think about like the whole of the parts, and we'll be going between those ways of thinking a bit in this session. And we can think about mobility, stability, reminding us of the ongoing flux of life with all these different kinds of processes of change and landing, and when you feel like you're still for too long, you might get uncomfortable and you need to shift. And so we have the principle of shape flow here, or the principle of shape support, as a way of mobilizing on a really small scale, and that becomes a way of finding some sort of continuity and endurance also. So there's a few different things we'll do. Lying, probably we'll start lying and go to standing eventually, so it'll start with a more of a stable feeling, because we'll be more low to the ground with a bit more basic support, and then we'll find more traveling and locomotion later. Okay, please bring yourself to lying on the ground if you're not already there. And I'm going to do also some lying on the ground. And start by noticing where is in contact with the ground. And you can start to explore the underside, the contact with your body and the ground. And how if you shift a little bit, some parts of you leave the ground and some parts find the ground. For example, side of my head finding more contact with the earth, and rolling to find more of the back of the skull again, leaving that side. Coming into a sense of body in connection to ground and to gravity. Gravity doing its job to hold you on the ground. And you can find moments where you fight gravity to reach a little bit, and then if you let go of this muscular action of going into space above you, to release the arms, to let them go as passive, or to release the weight of the leg, we find a sense of passive weight onto the ground, to sense the weight of your body. And this making passive means sometimes a letting go of extra tension or holding in your body. And so you might continue to roll to find moments of passive weight. Letting go into gravity, into the base of support, but continuing to find little shifts to make yourself comfortable or to explore your surfaces in relationship with the ground. So take some time to do that. And every time you make a little shift, notice whether it's more of a slide So you don't really change the contact or the pressure of the contact with the ground. Or whether it's a little push, or whether it's a combination of both, a push and a slide. And this little push reminds us that we can make our weight passive, and then we can activate our weight in order to push. And a roll is a different kind of experience, pouring the weight through your body. So pushing, sliding, rolling is all ways of mobilizing your body and giving yourself a different experience of the weight of your body. You might slide a limb and it might feel actually like it's quite passive and relaxed. You might push a limb and feel the activation from that part that's contacting the ground through to the rest of you, or through to some part of you. Or you might roll and feel the pouring contents with a push and a slide, maybe more together. And with a little push, you can do more of them. So finding a pulse in whatever part is in contact with the ground. It might be just underneath the hand, or it might be underneath the side of pelvis, or underneath the feet. Just set up a little rock somewhere through your body. And you can stay there for a while before you move on. And this pulsation, mobilizing through the weight of your body, is in order to find this synergistic relationship between stability and mobility. You're having to make your weight more passive in order to keep reinitiating the push. So there's a sense of stabilizing through mobility. If I imagine myself to be on a surface where I was imprinting ink from underneath my feet or underneath my hands, I would be leaving a denser amount of pigment. Or if I was on sand, there would be a clearer footprint, perhaps. So coming into a sense of your body's weight, but with flow, not holding on to find the sense of your body's weight, but letting go into gravity. It's quite a subtle difference with teasing apart here. The weight of your body in motion rather than in passive collapse. And this is a little dance of letting go, holding on in a very tiny amount of rhythm. And if you haven't come up to sit and you're still lying, you're welcome to explore a little level change of lying to sitting, rocking and sitting. I'm including this action of heel rock sometimes in sitting, extending and flexing at the ankles, stabilizing with the bone with a sense of direction. So this principle of spatial intent of the heels into the earth. So finding a little flow through pelvis. And then I might get interested in what a whole more surface in contact with the ground could produce. Finding the side of my ribs here to push into. Or if I find a little rock through the upper body, palms connecting into shoulder blades, finding a rock for the front of my body here. You can find it from the toes also. So I consider this material to be about arriving in the weight of your body with the flow of your body. And when I say the flow of your body, I mean its ongoing fluidness. That we're more than 70% water, and that fluidity has density. And if I pay attention to the pouring weight of my body, that might be a slower tempo than the speed of a push. Something a bit more quick about this pulsation. And a roll can still be active in my weight. I don't have to roll and flop. I can roll and pour and have a sense of the ongoingness of rolling rather than a placing and a pausing. So there's an ongoingness to the roll, which means adding in some sort of spatial intent, giving me some direction of travel, and that might be in one direction, or it could be in many directions at once. So if I explore spatial intent in many directions, that might take me into an expansion. And then if I explore spatial intent towards my navel center, we have limbs, head and tail coming into the center of the body. Let's play a little through head-tail connection. So mobilizing spine. How can we do that? We can initiate from the tailbone, we can initiate from the head. And we can consider the three different aspects of spinal flexion in the sagittal and extension. And you can do that pattern sitting, you can do it in all fours. You can also find it lying on the ground in the supine foot position, bringing skull and tail towards each other and away. Then you might exhale to condense. Inhale to extend. Finding the supportive breath for this change in the organization of your spine, and as well through the proximal joints of the shoulders and into the pelvis. And then we can find also a sense of the lateral flexion of the spine, head and tail coming towards each other. Finding how pelvis also shifts, so one side of the pelvis is slightly higher, or one sitting bone reaches away, and the other sitting bone reaches away. And you can find this sitting, standing, lying. If you find it lying, again with the knees bent, you can find a sense of sliding on the ground again to make this possible. And I'm seeing that my knees go from being fairly even, and if I take this lateral flexion through my spine, one of my knees starts to travel further towards my foot. And I could add in, if I wanted, a knee drop here, the diagonal knee reach. So I have a lateral flexion and a diagonal knee reach. That might be quite new if you've been doing knee drop for a while with the spine staying more in the middle. How is it to have this additional flexion of the spine and a reach of the knees? And that might feel more extreme through the lumbar vertebrae, so if it doesn't feel nice, don't bother doing it. You can still explore lateral flexion without a knee reach. And equally, you can take a lateral flexion and a diagonal knee reach in the opposite direction. But then we're starting to turn pelvis and find more of this sagittal aspect, which is another spatiality for spine. So let's stick with this for now. I can bring that to sitting again. Feel it, head leading into ground, tail bringing me back up again, tail leading me into ground, head bringing me back up again, head leading into ground, tail initiating to come back up, head leading, pelvis following, or pelvis leading. Lead. We can find this little lateral pelvic shift with head, tail in this side-side flexion. But I've also got a little moment where I find more sagittal flexion in the front as I bring my knees up. So a very easy shift of weight across sitting bones, allowing the knees to fold with an ongoing spinal flexion. But equally, I could make it far more about the sagittal if I wanted to, by coming up, over myself, coming up. You see, I find it easier to find actually a little bit of circling through the skull. So we have lateral and sagittal flexion taking place at the same time. But if I wanted to have my hands on the ground, then maybe I wouldn't need to find so much sagittal flexion to do this. And I could concentrate more on the mobilization through the lower legs. Lateral pelvic shift across pelvis. If I don't use my hands, I have to use more of the musculature of my lower body to make that happen. If I use a push, then I feel a connection from my hands through shoulder girdle, through spine into pelvis. So a different coordination of my whole body, if I use my hands on the ground or not, and they're both interesting and they're both useful. Okay, so we have another organisation of head-tail connection to mobilise. Let's come back to the supine hook position. And this time find the spine in the middle, knees folding to one side. So allowing the weight of the knees to come sideways and then the pelvis to go, which is going to rotate the spine, and the head can turn in the opposite direction. And then we can bring the skull back and allow navel to yield in the direction of gravity, exhaling to bring the pelvis back to the middle. Knees go, feet are staying quite connected to the earth, just opening the sides of the feet, the outside edges, the outside edge of one and the inside edge of the other. Yes, the outside edge of both feet. Head coming back to the middle. Unwinding the spine. So it's the inside edge of one foot peeling away from the ground and the outside edge of the other foot. And that's inviting this spiraling relationship through spine. And skull can come back. You can bring one knee up and then the other knee if you wish. Diagonal knee reach can be done with a simultaneity of the knees. Or one knee and the other knee. Exploring the relationship of head-tail connection, mobilizing now through rotation. Giving yourself time to breathe. And then let's come to find this rotation through spine in sitting. mobilizing pelvis into spine, into skull, and pelvis back. And the skull comes back to the middle. So the tempo is very even. I'm not using a sense of acceleration or deceleration to do this. Giving myself the time to mobilize through the spatial experience of rotation. But with lots of breath support, so you're not binding your flow to find this kind of evenness. Maybe the word steady is more useful here. And you can take the skull first and allow the ribcage to follow. Coming back with the skull first and the rest of the spine. So these are quite small movements of spine and rotation, but we can take that into something with more continuity through rolling again. How is it to explore head-tail connection by rolling spine? So sometimes the whole spine might simply come in one piece as you roll from one side to the other side. Sometimes pelvis might lead, traveling through into skull. Pelvis might lead, continuing into skull. Or you might find the head turning first and then the rest of the body following. Play around with those options for yourself, with the head leading a roll, and see if you can allow this to travel from skull through to pelvis and not just go head, pelvis. Can you delay a little bit with the lower body so more of the rib cage comes with you first? And your head, as mine is doing, might leave the ground, or it might stay on the ground the whole time, and you're just going to have to figure out where your arms go. So sometimes they might slide underneath the gap that's left between the waist and the ribcage, or maybe they slide over the head. And that might occasionally bring you to sit. And maybe to shift base of support back into the ground to roll some more. And you might, as we do this, start to notice what happens with your spine as you make the level change. Do you find a sagittal flexion? Do you find a lateral flexion? Do you find the pelvis going first to lay your spine down? So all of these are possible. And here is an opportunity to see how you do it. You might find a sense of circling, as we found earlier with the spine. Head finding a journey down to the ground that feels more like an ellipse, where the spine has this condensing in the sagittal, but also a sense of side-sidedness. And keeping it at an evenish tempo, trying not to add too much momentum yet. Not least because adding momentum can make you feel dizzier sooner. And we want to be able to keep going for a bit. But if at any time you do start to feel dizzy, of course, pause, rest, take stillness, recuperate. Okay. So, find a heel rock, legs long. Experiencing the sense of your vertical throughness from heels through pelvis through into spine. And notice what moves. And whether you need to include a little bit of additional flexion through the knees so pelvis feels like it can get going. That's also fine. Or you keep your knees fairly relaxed and see what happens there. And we'll do what we did in the other mobility stability class, where you kind of pin part of your body in space, to kind of hold it and see what happens to your heel rock. Can you still heel rock by, for example, clenching your fists and having your shoulders a little bit off the ground, and then when you let go, then what else moves? How is it to try and fix one leg and still find your heel rock with the other leg, and notice what happens when you let go? How is it to maybe clench the muscles of your belly and still find heel rock? What moves, what doesn't move? And then let go. What about screwing up the muscles of your face? See what happens to the neck. And then as you release, what other motion can be found there? And of course, with heel rock, resting whenever you wish. Option of soles of the feet, heel rock. And then find a moment of stillness in this supine hook position, and we'll take a few sagittal and lateral pelvic shifts. So classic Bartenieff fundamental exercise of these very tiny shifts of the pelvis, mobilizing through the lower, which she observed in many people was not so mobile. This kind of lower part of the spine was not always free to move in walking, and it's pretty crucial for shifting the weight over the feet. So, soles of the feet on the ground. You might need to have a little look and just see whether they're in parallel to start with. I sometimes have to check what mine are doing by looking at them, and then lie down again and try to trust that they are parallel, even if they don't feel particularly parallel. Now, the bend of the knees here makes a huge difference. If your feet are very far from your pelvis, it's going to be really hard. So you can have your sits bones pretty close to your heels. And then finding, first of all, pressing into the feet to simply lift the pelvis off the ground and put it back down again. So you're lifting your pelvis off only a tiny amount, so you could just slide like the hand underneath and then put it back down. And let's do this with an exhale, breathing out, floating pelvis off the ground, putting it back down, getting used to that feeling of taking the weight out of the pelvis. And so the pressure increases through a small push underneath the feet, underneath the shoulders. And it's barely a push, really, really small. So that you feel this pouring of weight that we did earlier, coming into the skull a little bit. So you're not having to start from the push. We can maybe start from a sense of floating pelvis. Or maybe we can start by softening into the whole of the back surface of the body, to then float. Now let's add a sense of pelvis traveling towards your feet. So as you lift, rather than just going up off the floor, I'm showing it with my hands, there's a feeling of the pelvis going towards where your knees are and coming back again, but without tipping the pelvis to do that. So it's very small. I'm going to show it very big so you can maybe see what I mean. I'm taking my pelvis towards my feet and lifting it at the same time and bringing it back down. So maybe if I just jump into this patch of sunshine, maybe it illuminates what's going on a bit better. So if I take my arm, but maybe you can see, well, maybe that doesn't work actually. But you can see, hopefully, that I'm not tucking my pelvis to make this happen. I'm keeping my pelvis parallel with the ceiling, lifting it. There's a sense of lengthening of my spine as my pelvis, as my pubic bone reaches sort of in between my knees. And then to come back, I could push through my feet, or I could lengthen through the top of my skull and find a little reach through head tail towards the space above my head. Inhale to prepare. Exhale, sagittal pelvic shift. Inhale to return. So I'm not hanging out there when I arrive. I'm only going so far as I feel I can go before I start to feel unsteady between my 2 feet. It might be that pelvis tips or shifts. Here's an opportunity to see if we can find simultaneity of the lower body, both legs working together, weight equally distributed between 2 feet.
Ali,
Yes.
how do you prevent the shoulders from getting involved? Like I feel like the shoulders are crunching up to lift the pelvis.
Maybe figure out a different position for your arms to be in. So your arms might be more comfortable a bit higher or even above your head. So there's a bit more space for the shoulder blades to be. So that's happening, right? How about having your palms on the ground? So if your arms are sort of at a 45-degree angle to your body and your palms are on the ground, I mean, your shoulders are going to move a little bit, but with the palms down, maybe it gives a little bit more space to the shoulder blades. There's something about also resting the breastbone so that you're feeling the back of the rib cage still kind of on the ground, but I guess if your curve here is quite pronounced, then maybe you feel like more of the shoulders move. If it's uncomfortable through the shoulders, keep playing with where the arms could be, but also really sighing out, maybe even sigh through the mouth on the initiation. So inhale to prepare, and then sigh. And then right at the end of the sigh, then make your sagittal pelvic shift and then come back again. And that might get even more into the mobility through the breastbone and like the softening through the backs of the ribs. Have a little explore with that breath support.
And your knees go a bit forward because it feels
Yeah.
to me that it all goes into the knees and the feet are not grounding down, so they kind of lift up.
Yeah, so this is again about redistributing where the force is traveling, and you can like really imagine your feet are sinking and imprinting onto the ground. So activating the weight of the feet. If it helps to take some little steps and like stamp a little bit, that can really kind of activate that sense of okay, here are your feet. And you can also help maybe to place your hands on your thighs and give that little push into the thighs to feel the flow of the weight from your hands through your knees, down your shins, into your feet. Can you feel that? Here's an exercise, or here's an example of an exercise where it can be really nice doing this in shoes, so that you already add more weight to your feet to receive the weight of your pelvis. So finding an exhale, pressing into the feet, allowing the knees to float. And finding that sigh right at the end of the exhale. So, so the back of the hamstrings are definitely going to work. What are you observing?
Sorry?
What are you observing? Was it any easier?
So I put my heels very close to my buttocks,
Yeah,
and
good.
I felt that made it easier. I'm not sure if I'm like gripping my buttocks as opposed to letting the hamstring. I'm not quite sure. I haven't figured it out. It feels very important exercise.
I mean, it is very interesting to see what the kind of balance of the muscles are. Sometimes when I'm doing it or I'm teaching it to people, they're using their thigh muscles a lot. And so Can you let go of some of the use of the thighs and use more of, I don't know, pelvic floor, for example? Some people are using the gluteus quite a lot and maybe need to engage the hamstrings a little bit more. And so there's just this sort of exploration of how you can find it as a very relaxed action, actually.
Oh,
yeah, I know. How can you do it in a very relaxed way? So this sense of pouring the weight, pressing slowly into the ground, you know, like all the things that we did in rolling, like here is where you can apply it. But equally, you can find a little rock, like the kind of heel rock version, and then just be like, oh, just add a little bit of a spatial intent. What is it to then take pelvis off the ground and find a rock? And maybe even find a bit more quickness, actually. So you can find a version that has an exhale which is quicker. So it's a more of a quick initiation rather than this really slow, steady pouring of the weight that can feel actually sometimes quite heavy through the muscles and through the joints. What is it to find a bit of quickness? So we're finding a little bit of momentum. Which might make your experience of the action different by adding more speed, for example. And I've been doing it with the exhale, but equally you can find it with an inhale. And then relax to come back. So these different patterns of breath support might also do something different. Any discoveries?
I think just for me, this is like quite challenging.
Sure.
There's a lot of things get involved that shouldn't get involved.
I mean, so your shoulders are going to like experience a different placement because the rest of your spine is being moved from the tail. If you feel like you're using your shoulders to make it happen, then maybe there's something there about trying to keep inviting the lower body to be really active. You know, all this work that we just did about like tail leading you down to the ground, pelvis leading first, you know, like pelvis going somewhere and the rest of the body follows. So the whole of the pelvis is starting off the action. It's a similar principle here where the pelvis is really leading, but with the use of the feet. But equally, we can find it in sitting, yeah? So you can find like this kind of thing, trying to like bring your pelvis to your feet. It's quite hard. But obviously like quite a lot of muscles around the tops of the thighs have to engage. But it's about this relationship of the pelvis to the feet. So you can, you know, push through your feet and travel. But I can also bring my pelvis across. And like all of this kind of exploration of taking your pelvis over your feet without using your hands, you have to use a lot of the kind of coordination through the feet. I don't know, I use my shoulders to do that. Yeah, it's possible. But can I keep my upper body really relaxed and just shift my pelvis over my feet? Yeah?
And when you say that the tail leads to do this, how can the tail do that? It seems like it's the pelvis you have to do.
I mean, it's the whole of the pelvis. It's not just the tailbone. I mean, I'm also thinking about the pubic symphysis, so where the bones meet in the front. This bone gives some sense of direction. And you've got the iliac crests to think about. So these big wing bones of the pelvis. One side and the other side.
And do you feel the heels get involved? Because I feel like I make it happen a little bit from the heels.
Great. I mean, the heels definitely get involved because what you're finding is the relationship between the heels and the sitting bones. So it's perfect that the heels get involved. So anything that has to do with like pushing or extending the leg is a relationship between the base of the pelvis, sitting bone, to the heel bone. So maybe that's something worth thinking about on sagittal pelvic shift. Sitting bones traveling actually towards the heels and slightly off the ground. It's like your sitting bones are trying to touch the backs of your Achilles. I think that's probably enough sagittal pelvic shift. Any other observations?
Yeah, don't worry. It's just for me, it's really hard. It's like I feel like the front body is working so hard. So the back, I'm almost scared to let go of the front body because then I feel it would be more weight on me.
Yeah, but you have to. This is the kind of the relationship between heel rock and this exercise, where the front body is very soft and the back body is like really quite stable. It's like mobilizing on the ground, and all the front of the body is just going along for the ride. And if you can find that here, what would that change about your stability in the feet?
Yeah, it's a real shift in the brain that it's quite hard to get around.
Yeah, and it's also kind of an interesting idea to think about the front body and the back body, because is the front of the body only the front surface? Because the whole of my back surface isn't in contact with the ground. Like there's part of the back of me that's also off the ground, you know, like the back of my neck is in contact with the air. But I think about the back of me trying to soften into the ground, but it's impossible because I have curves of the spine and like these little gaps underneath my wrists, you know? So even what we conceptualize as the front body and the back body, you know, is only a concept. But it's an interesting exploration of what then feels like it's more stable or mobile, for sure.
Yeah, because it just feels like the head really pushes into the ground and the heels pushes into the ground, but it feels that whole arch of the back is not connecting. So it's kind of like the front of the body has to kick in to make it happen because there's not the connection between.
I mean, there will be this whole kinetic chain through from inner ankles, through the legs, into the psoas, into the diaphragm, into the whole of the musculature of the spine, into the skull. So this, like, you know, this long line from the inner line of the, you know, thighs through the pelvis into the spine, into the skull, is part of it. It's actually like the core of the heel rock, right?
But so it's more the middle of the body, not the back surface.
Yeah, because those are the muscles that are engaging, but it's because your muscles are connected to the bones that we can think about, you know, the vertebrae, but we can think about also the front of the spine. You know how sometimes we've imaged the front surface of the sacrum, like the inside surface of the sacrum, or the inside surface of the lumbar vertebrae, and the like inside surface of the thoracic spine. So right in the center of the chest, behind the heart.
That feels easier if I think about the front of the spine as opposed to the back of the spine.
Great, because it's also mobilizing, but it's slightly different to the back, you know, like, yeah, if I think about the core of my spine and the front surface of my spine, and then if I find that sense of the inside surface of the back of sacrum, leaving the ground and coming back to the ground with sagittal pelvic shift. And I also feel the corresponding rock of skull. Okay. Thank you for those questions. They were really helpful to kind of investigate the mobility stability of sagittal pelvic shift, because it is complicated. It looks so simple, but it's so complicated. Okay. in this last sort of 10 minutes or so, let's carry on exploring mobilizing from sitting to all fours, or to hands and feet mobilizing with this connection of head-tail support. So this developmental pattern of head-tail connection, now finding a relationship of heels to sitting bones. And maybe hands and arms can come into play as well. So using the flexion or the extension through the spine and the rotation to shift you in space. So to find traveling and shifting your base of support, and maybe finding yourself on all fours, or even on 1 foot or 2 feet. So finding level changing, mobilizing through space, giving yourself maybe a direction of travel, or your direction of travel keeps changing. I'm going sideways, I'm going forwards, around myself. And every now and again, if you feel like you're going into momentum, and that's going to get really tiring or dizzying, go back into this pouring of the weight to make all these shifts. And if you never really play with momentum, if you're often working in a very steady tempo, what is it to let that become more momentum driven? So the weight of your body has to organize itself through the free flow. And you might find that sense of releasing into gravity again. You can release the weight of your arms and find the passive weight of your arms to find a swing. Or you might find this more steady, smooth shifting of weight, pouring from one surface to another surface. So all the principles we were finding on the ground, using those now either to come out of the ground or in standing, pouring the weight, shifting weight with momentum, or sliding on the ground. Seeing how wherever your base of support is, you can push from, be received into, carrying your pelvis over 1 foot or both feet. Feeling that relationship of head-tail. Does head lead? Does tail lead? Does the whole spine activate together? And whenever you wish, you can take a little walk. Feeling an easy shift of weight between 2 feet. Recording that sense of the center of spine and how a walk can be a pouring of weight, or it could be a momentum-based action that would take you into a run. Or you might find the push of the walk. Landing pelvis over the foot to then push away. So quite a few different possibilities we've talked about of how locomotion and level change might be organized through this mobilization of weight and flow that gives you a sense of ground. Some people talk about it as grounding, but it could be considered, stability whilst mobilizing. Mobilizing with stability. And that might be, as we've talked about, mobilizing a particular part of your body, or a sense of mobilizing everything. And you might notice that you're stable in one part in order to mobilize something else. Or you might find that you mobilize somewhere and need to stabilize somewhere in order to do that. Taking a couple more minutes to yourself. Level changing, shifting, rolling. Noticing how breath support can come into this in different ways, so that if you're rolling yourself, pouring the weight through foot to foot, how is it affecting your use of breath? And if that's what you wanted to do more of, to pour the weight, what does your breath have to do to make that even more possible? And if you're sliding along the ground, what does that do to your breath support? And with more momentum, more speed, can you still stay full in the breath? It might make sense to exhale to find some flow and movement. Or it might make sense to find an inhale to initiate, but then not to hold the breath as you keep finding more flow. I found a bit of spinning, turning, this rotational aspect. Using it as a thing to come into, or maybe something to resolve movement out of. I find maybe a balance, and I could rotate out of it. Pouring the weight through into one foot to then shift and turn. And then find a moment of standing on 2 feet. Sensing how you feel your body on 2 feet. The small micro adjustments of your shifts of weight. sensing the length of spine. Navel center to heels, navel center to top of skull, 2 arms, 2 legs. Great, and let's come together for a little chat. Lots of different ways. I'll show you one that we didn't do a lot of today, but is easier to show slowly. So if I'm going to come down to the ground from standing, I might come into this sort of cross-lateral shape where my head condenses towards my navel center, and then I'm finding a bit of side-sidedness as I rotate to here. I'm not sure if you can see that so well, but there's, if I find my head and my tail, and then at a certain point I find turning a rotation through my skull.